Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our webinar series on how large companies evaluate suppliers. I'm delighted to be joined today by Sara Mortimore, who I'll introduce now. And we're going to go through a lot on understanding how companies, retailers, manufacturers, and even regulators evaluate food producers. It's critical, obviously, for food safety, for quality, operational purposes. And Sarah has a wealth of experience in this area. So, um, Sarah, she's a leading expert in this area with over 40 years of experience in food safety, quality, and regulatory. She's co-authored many books on the subject on successful book, or sorry, many successful books and chapters on HACCP and food safety management. She was the global vice president of food safety for Walmart, which had a very large footprint of 10,500 brick and mortar stores. So significant scale and responsibility for huge amounts of food safety and a very fast developing business, even moving into online e-commerce. Sara was a recipient of the IAFP Black Pearl Award during her time at Walmart, which is a very excellent achievement. And previous to that, having been on the retail side, previous to that, she was on the manufacturing side with working with many different organizations, including Land O'Lakes, the second largest agricultural co-op in the US. And previous to that, companies like GlaxoSmithKline and Grand Metropolitan Foods, which was eventually acquired by General Mills. So now Sarah sits on many advisory boards, including Musgrave Group Food Safety Advisory Board and the Camden BRI Advisory Council. In fact, that's where we met. I'm fortunate enough to be also on that council, and it was great to meet Sarah there. So I'll just say a brief word about myself. So I'm Cronin McNamara. I'm the founder and CEO of Creme Global, and we're a scientific data company and AI based in Dublin, Ireland, but working with industry and government all around the world, trying to help with the science of food safety, quality, and using risk models and data to help, I suppose, safeguard reputations, ensure food safety, and protect consumers all around the world. We take a very scientific approach to gathering data, structuring data, and setting up collaborations between industry groups and regulators using the best available data and AI. So this will be a fascinating discussion, I think, we're coming from the data side, really trying to understand the on-the-ground experience that Sarah, you have from your experience. So welcome, Sarah, and maybe tell us a little bit more about your background, and then we'll jump into some Q&A.
Thanks, Cronin. Yeah, I have a lengthy background, and I feel really fortunate to have worked both in manufacturing and in retail. A little bit in food service with Haagen-Dazs in the Haagen-Dazs days in Diageo as well. But it gives you such a good perspective of the supply chain, the industry. I also worked in distribution for a bit. So, I've kind of got that whole farm to fork with Land O'Lakes right through to consumer with the latter job in retail. So I've got a really good lens on the industry. And I'm glad you mentioned consumers, Cronin, because it's totally about consumers and getting the safe food on the table, on the shelf for them. And we sometimes lose sight of that, I think, in whether in manufacturing or retailing, it's about the product, but it's actually about food which is meant to nurture, to sustain life. And it's something that goes into us and becomes part of us. And that's a huge responsibility, incredible responsibility. So we have to do the best we possibly can to make sure that we maintain that trust that consumers have in the food industry as a whole. And the supplier piece is a really important part of that, seeing that whole supply chain and looking back up the supply chain in each of our roles, whether you're in manufacturing, looking at ingredient suppliers or contract manufacturers for your brand, or when retailing, putting national branded products on the shelf or private branded. It's about trust. trust with the company above you in the supply chain, the distributor below you in the supply chain, and ultimately with the consumer. So it's a really important topic. And I think we're all part of that continuum, that ecosystem that makes that happen. And we're not getting it right yet either. So there's a lot more work to be done. And so I'm really interested in this conversation.
Yeah, exactly. We're all food consumers. We all have family and friends, and we have to trust the food products that we all love and the brands that we've grown up with and admire. So and as you said, we're still not getting everything right. And I always think, it's such a massive industry and there are so many variables. We're going to get into that there's always going to be some incidents that occur, and but at the same time, and I think we discussed this last time, there are too many incidents that are occurring that shouldn't be happening. So even
Yeah.
at the recent GFSI conference in Dublin a few weeks ago, they had a talk called Back to the Future, and they looked at incidents that have been happening for the last 40, 50, 60 years, and they're reoccurring, and they're not seeming to get any lower in prevalence, which is disappointing. So it'll be good to figure out, maybe discuss that as well. But the main topic, we want to talk about today is how that relationship, I suppose, between the large companies who are buying either products or ingredients or supplies of any sort that goes into the food manufacturing process, what are they looking for to try to ensure that quality and safety, and going, I suppose, above and beyond, perhaps even just regulation and regulatory standards. What are they, and how can we, then think about what data could be used to monitor that surveillance that you're talking about. So that's really what I'd love to get into today. So let's jump in then. I suppose from your experience over the many different organizations that you've worked for, what do you think, how do large companies, go about that, monitoring those suppliers and manufacturers, and how do they balance those requirements with other pressures that they might be under, for example, cost or
Mm.
the need to have product ready to go?
Yeah. Um, I've been on both sides because I've worked in manufacturers that also supply private label to retailers, as well as being a retailer that was on the other side of the fence. And I think today I'd say we recognize more that trust is what you're buying. You're buying that, and you're buying reliability. So in my experience, it's today with the bigger companies, with the companies with high integrity, it's less about that cost pressure. You have to be efficient, but it isn't about necessarily getting the cheapest item you can whack onto the shelf. You want to make sure it's always going to be on the shelf. It's reliably going to be produced, and that means it's going to be safe. There's nothing worse than an empty shelf in retailing because the product's been withdrawn, recalled, and we know that only too well from a couple of years ago with the infant formula crisis, where there was so little infant formula available. It was
Mhm.
just awful. Being in Walmart and seeing our customers coming in looking for baby formula, and they had to have it, and
Yeah,
it
yeah,
was just awful. So
yeah.
trust is important, and I think we're willing to pay for that reliability and trustworthiness as
Mhm.
a purchaser, as a specifier of those goods. And what we're looking for when we're evaluating suppliers, because it starts with that supplier approval, then monitoring comes later, but the supplier approval, GFSI did a good thing in that as that evolved, 25 years ago, it raised the bar, and there's now an entry level.
Mhm.
So for many companies, they'll say they've got to have a GFSI certified scheme, benchmark scheme certificate. So you need that as a starting point, and that's part of ongoing monitoring and surveillance.
Mhm.
But I think you'll find today that it's more than that. That's not enough because we're
Yeah.
seeing these recalls come from, by and large, certified companies. So something isn't working. And to me, it is about the baseline. GFSI is able to set standards for benchmarking against pest control, consumer response or complaints handling, that you've got your documentation in order, that you've got a cleaning program, that you've got a HACCP plan. They're not necessarily going to be able to go and invalidate the contents of that HACCP plan. And I think it's taken us a while to understand that, and understand that actually that is the role of the company who's buying the product, the large company or a smaller company who's the specifier, who owns that specification, who's purchasing the product. So we're, I think, going in more often than maybe we did when the GFSI schemes first started out, because we're going in and now validating against specification that we own, and really looking at the capability of that supplier to meet our requirements. And those requirements might be over and above what's in the GFSI benchmarking requirements. So they pretty much are, because they're all around the product that you're purchasing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. So the GFSI certification is a good baseline, but you're finding that, there's different levels of quality around how people are, delivering or developing their HACCP plans. So therefore, you have to kind of go a step further and inspect or validate those facilities, which obviously is a massive challenge with the scale you would have been dealing with in Walmart and even in your previous roles. So,
Yeah.
so I think, I'm thinking about what maybe further data could be gathered to help, prioritize, I suppose, the risks of different suppliers, or even ongoing monitoring of the quality of their, implementation of their plans, I suppose.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. When I'm looking at a supplier, I really want to know that they're capable. Are
Hmm.
they capable of making a safe quality product and doing that every single time? So there's the integrity piece, which leads somewhat into food safety culture. It's also about transparency of communications. And then there's also the technical aspect, their quality of their hazard analysis, the validity of their hazard analysis as they put their HACCP system together, or their food safety plan together, or in the US, whether it's HARPC, hazard analysis, risk-based preventive control. It's all based on a hazard analysis, risk assessment approach. And so I'm looking at whether the supplier has the capability for that. And when I was in Walmart, we were testing out some different ways of doing it. Certainly supplier questionnaires, which many organizations have, but also we were homing in on the product and what was making the product safe, and asking our suppliers that same question. Do you understand what's making your product safe? Please articulate that to us. And we did start to see some key themes as we did that. Firstly, not all of them could answer that very simple question, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
But you can cross-check that against industry reference materials. There's some really good, ICMSF or FDA Appendix 1. I mean, there's plenty of good data, published data, for which our people in office could be cross-checking, cross-referencing. Could you automate that? Yeah, I think you could look at what the supplier's feeding into you against what the recognized sources of information would tell you. So it's about technical competency. So we were asking suppliers that, and you'd really see whether they understood, whether the regulations that applied to them were uppermost in their mind. Did they understand what was changing in regulations? Are suppliers really looking at what failures are occurring in industry? And you talked about the Back to the Future. I did the Camden lecture about 5 years ago, actually, and I talked about that same topic 5 years ago.
Yeah.
We can't lose sight of the basics, the foundational, because those things are what's causing quite often the recalls. So, it's really understanding some of those aspects as well. What's the root cause analysis telling us? What failures are happening in the category that you're making? Are you aware of that?
Yeah, exactly.
Some companies aren't doing that surveillance, and so they're not aware and they're not really digging back into their facilities to say, could that ever happen to us? Because complacency is the enemy.
Yeah,
And if you're complacent and think it's never happened here, that's not us, then that's not a good place to be ever.
exactly. Trying to learn from the knowledge that's being gained around the industry, either through things going badly or going well. And I think these food safety conferences are great for that, but perhaps not
Yeah.
everybody's attending those conferences. And we talked about it the other day that you were sometimes amazed that people weren't using technologies that had been around for a decade, that you thought everybody was using them, but they're not. So,
Yeah.
it's about that. Those types of newer approaches, getting into the industry, into the far reaches of the industry, to make sure that everybody's coming up to speed with the latest and thinking and the latest approaches to food safety. So I'm just
Yeah.
wondering,
Yeah.
do the regulations kind of reflect that, I suppose, in that they get updated from time to time, and would those play a role in trying to disseminate that knowledge out to the broader aspects of the food sector?
Only if you're looking, and of course, it takes a long time to get a regulation put in
Mhm.
place. So the US is doing a decent job, I think, in having draft regulations out there. But I was at
Mhm.
the BRCGS conference in Milan a month or so ago, and giving a session on the new codex, general principles of food hygiene and hazard, the
Mhm.
foundations, Back to the Future. That document's it was overdue a refresh. It took 10 years to get done through Codex, which
Yeah.
works through multiple regulators. And we did a quick poll of the audience. How many people have read the new Codex document that took them nearly 10 years to get published? 10%?
Mhm.
10%. And these are auditors. These are
Yeah.
professional food safety people at high integrity because they're honest about whether they'd read it or not, which is fantastic.
Mhm.
But in GFSI now, it talks about some of the detail isn't in there. It's really saying, and the schemes must comply with the latest Codex document. Well, if you're not familiar with that, that's not going to be terribly helpful, actually. It's
Yeah.
going to be quite damaging. And
Yeah.
so I think that's a role that large companies can play, continue to play, in making sure their suppliers are aware of what's available. It means the onus is on the large company, the large organization, to help disseminate that information. But it is a
Mhm.
role that can be taken quite seriously, whether it's going into suppliers of infant formula and saying, well, you need an auto sampler here so that we've got
Mhm.
a much more accurate read on what's going on in your finished product, as opposed to offline periodic sampling. I think that's something that we can do as large organizations, whether you're in retailing or manufacturing,
Yeah.
making sure that we are familiar with those technologies, and that takes people power, of course, as well.
Yeah.
But it's something that can be done. But it's
Yeah.
not everyone. There's an awful lot of smaller artisanal companies popping up, which go into retailers under their own brand initially, and then if it does well, then it might convert to a private brand. But who's helping them?
Yeah. Exactly. So.
Not extension services in the US, but I don't know globally.
So yeah, the regulations move slowly. They take time to get updated, and then not everybody's familiar with those, or always keeping up to date with them, and not even, especially not the ones that are potentially coming down the line. So I think that is an interesting role, I suppose, that industry can play to force those requirements down the chain, I suppose, onto manufacturers. So to make sure they have that knowledge, or using the best available approaches and technologies in their manufacturing. But I think you're saying that that's not necessarily happening, right now, in a broad enough way to kind of adopt those latest approaches, right?
Yeah, I mean it's a big responsibility then on the purchaser, the specifier, to make sure
Yeah.
that you've got all the things that you think ought to be in place. And we're not experts. Certainly, when you go into retailing, Walmart, we had some category specialists. That's something we put in place.
Yeah.
And so in a very good way. So we had produce people, dairy people, meat people,
Yeah.
so they could go deep into those categories. As the US becomes more and more into private brand, I think that will probably happen more. That's very much the model that European retailers have. And the European retailers, I think, did an excellent job in passing a lot of knowledge onto their suppliers. I was one of them many years ago. I probably had 20 audits a year, but my gosh, that was a rich teaching moment every time a technologist or an auditor came into my facility, much more so than a single annual GFSI audit. We have to think about how to close that gap, actually, that's left by, in a good way, the certification, but the less contact with your multiple auditors. But the technologists and the people that go and discuss the product are the people that now have to be that link. And have to be conversant in what the most current best practices and technologies are, because you need to be looking at what's best practice, not what's just okay. I think you need to, as we said at the beginning, what's the best we can do for the consumer. And
Exactly.
it's not just okay, it's really the best that we can be.
Yeah, so you mentioned that walking the floor and just observing the plant was a valuable resource of our knowledge, inspection for yourselves to do. What types of things would you be looking for in particular when you'd be reviewing a plant like that?
Yeah, what we were doing in Walmart and was almost an Gemba walk. A Gemba walk. We were not auditing because we were leaving that to GFSI, which we supported. But we were looking at, over and above that, what was very specific to our product. Whether you're purchasing a pulled pork product or a pizza or a filled sandwich, what was specific to that product for food safety? And really focusing in on that and looking at what the controls were that we expected to be there. Through pre-work, through supplier questionnaires, through a form that we asked them to fill out that was very product specific in food safety. And then we're really going in and discussion, lots of discussion, communication, sort of a food safety culture, if you will. Now that's got a label, but really it's a technical assessment and capability assessment and a trust assessment, really, of those suppliers. But you can do an awful lot in a half day or a day by being with the people, talking with them, discussing, having these sorts of conversations. Actually, what do you think about? What are your challenges? What are you thinking about codex and regulations? And you're just gauging all the time, how much do they know? All the time. And it's very informal, but it's very, very effective at building a picture of that supplier. And we had no checklist at all in our Walmart approach, because it was product specific and we go with where the day took us. Much harder to do. I don't see that you could easily replace what GFSI schemes do with that. But I know there's some interesting work going on with an alternative style of audit. I'm keeping a close eye on that, but it's complementary, very complementary. But for a purchaser, I think worked very well. And focusing on the high risk products too, because as you rightly said earlier, you couldn't possibly get everywhere. So you're focusing, like the FDA has with the traceability rule, you're starting with the highest risk ones, and then you can expand out.
So it's a risk-based approach, which makes a lot of sense. I'm wondering what kind of data you were kind of intuitively looking for on those walkarounds, and maybe what kind of IoT sensors or other types of data collection devices would you think could be complementary, I suppose, to what you were doing there, that could help kind of a database system kind of do that same kind of, well, not in the way you're talking to people and understanding their knowledge, but all just looking at maybe the operation of the facility, like, humidity, moisture,
Yeah.
temperatures. Would could some of that, be automated into a data collection process? I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think it's early days, and then that comes back to transparency and trust in the communication. But I think that's a very interesting area because you can't be there all the time.
Yeah.
Uh, and you think, gosh, when I'm not here, are they doing the right things? So having access to the data, in nearly all the companies I've worked in, we've been big advocates for the supplier owning the verification. So that's whether that's product testing, environmental testing, environmental monitoring testing. But looking at sensors, and some of the big companies, Nestle is one, I believe, that are really putting sensors in their plants and thinking about how they do internal audits because they've got access to that data. It's not necessarily putting cameras in. I think you can do that internally. And I have worked in companies that have done that. But you can certainly collect data on cold chain or heat data, so and have visibility of that.
Yeah.
I was thinking too about war on water. We talk about that a lot, and many facilities I go to are way too wet,
Yeah.
possibly because I know the Queen in the UK used to say everything smells of paint because it all gets painted before she got there. I used to think everybody's cleaning the plant before I step into it, so it's wet when I get there. It's sopping wet,
Is
it's
it always
dripping.
this wet? Yeah.
Quickly come clean it, but you think, gosh, it's
Yeah.
way too wet. This is encouraging,
Hmm.
encouraging growth of listeria here. This is not good
Hmm.
at all. And it's also acting now as a vector of transfer of any pathogen that you have in the environment. This is bad. So could we monitor that remotely? Maybe we could, in a way that we don't today, whether it's moisture sensors, as you alluded to, Cronin,
Yeah.
that be interesting. But also, having access to data, you'd have to have time to look at it. So that's where I think the AI tools can
Yeah.
really come in and help us, because there are only so many hours a day. And I think if we can really look at what can AI do for us to extend our capacity,
Yeah.
that's what becomes really interesting, whether it's screening those supplier questionnaires that we get in
Yeah.
to see what's missing, what data's missing that we expect to be there, or looking at remote monitoring data and making sense of that for us. I think that's something that is really exciting as it develops.
Yeah, that's a great lead into. I wanted to say a few things about AI, and it's true. Like, all of this data can be then fed into a system, even just to visualize the data and spot anomalies, or simple analytics like that. But as you build up enough data, and if you have multiple plants, and in fact, if those plants can share data or aggregate data over different aspects, and supply some metadata, for example, the information on maybe the temperature or the time of year, the seasonality, etc. You can actually potentially build up some predictive models that can help, I suppose, target the riskier times of year, different environments, and try to monitor those on an ongoing basis. Now we're only a few minutes to go, and I see there's one question on the chat already, so I might jump to that. We have one here for Sarah from BZAD. Thanks very much for the question. He's asking, you mentioned that large companies at times go even beyond the standards set by regulators. When this happens, do the large companies share the data with regulators? For example, what extra measures are implemented, and how those measures improve or not the safety of foods? That makes sense.
Yeah, and I know regulators would love to get more of the data that large companies have. And
Mhm.
so some of the data trusts that I know Creme Global is involved in is a really good way of making that data anonymized. Walmart was a member of the fraud one based out of the UK at Camden, Finn,
Yeah.
which I really was happy about. But I think it's more a question of meeting with regulators, as some of the big companies do quite periodically, and help them understand, almost like the state of the nation, what's really happening out there, because they don't have enough inspectors to get out there. They're not really, we're not always category specific like we can be, and really home in on what should be doing and is it being done. And I know one of my last meetings with FDA really talking about, I'm really worried about the inability to do a hazard analysis. I just don't see the capabilities out there. And it's almost going backwards, because people are inheriting their food safety plans and their food safety systems and don't own them like they did when they had to develop them. So being able to be part of that pulse intelligence, if you will, with regulators, I think is a role that industry can when you're large enough, to have that one-on-one platform, I think can be very helpful for regulators to hear that. And of course, as a large company, you do get to play in giving feedback and comments on organizations like Codex. I know I've been part of that as well. Very appreciative to be able to do that. But we do have that ability, and we take that responsibility quite seriously.
Yeah.
I hope that answers somewhat, do an insight into what you're asking.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I think the mention of data trust, data sharing is a great way to share knowledge in an industry group,
Yeah, yeah,
and learn from each other. If there's an incident that happens in a certain supplier in a certain region, if you can share that information broadly, and anonymously, perhaps throughout the industry, it's a great learning opportunity. And it immediately raises awareness of all the other members of the group to be vigilant for such a risk in the future. So
yeah,
I think data trusts, and then that data can be anonymized, aggregated, and we have enough data, you have big data now to feed more detailed visualizations, and potentially AI models. So to kind of then predict those anomalies, or predict the higher probability, at least, of those anomalies happening in the future in different times of year or different regions. So
yeah.
and
Helps us know where to look, where to focus, where
yeah,
to look.
yeah, it's that sharing that intelligence. So I think those data trusts have huge potential, and you mentioned the Fin one, which is all about food integrity.
Yeah,
We're working on another one on food safety with the Western Growers Organization in California, and others around different types of ingredients and chemicals of interest too. And the other benefit then is to have that sensible conversation with the regulators by showing, here's the data the industry has, and there's far more data than they could have had access to before, and perhaps
yeah.
aggregating that with public data to kind of really get the value of the big data.
It's very exciting.
Yeah, I think that is an exciting area to bring in. I think we've one more question, and I think then we're almost out of time. So this has come from Noel, and the question is, I assume correct labeling and vision inspection systems also play an important role in food safety. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely, and I think Cronin can answer that as well as I can, because here's an area where I think AI can really help us. Certainly in vision sorting systems, but labeling too. I mean, it's I remember putting barcode scanners on lines, and I couldn't believe the number of labels that we suddenly found that actually weren't correct. So very simple technology, but surprisingly, not everyone has that automated and online still. And that's a good example of a technology that's been around forever. But for the correct label being on the product that it's on, simple technology. But yeah, absolutely. So for allergens, not least. But anyone with any sort of intolerance, food intolerance, it's highly important to make sure that those labels are correct, of course. But vision sorters too, Cronin, right? I think those are starting to be able to gather data through AI in manufacturing as well now.
Yeah, exactly. We've seen some of these in operation, and they're just, the capabilities are incredible. The speed they can operate at, and the level of quality that they can operate at. That can avoid those mistakes. So as you're saying, these technologies have been around for a while. there's more and more sensors and IoT type devices that are getting cheaper and cheaper. But a lot of those data sets are still a bit stuck in silos, and it's sometimes hard to pull them all out into a system where you can actually learn from the big data. So that's going to be, I think, a challenge, but there's plenty of like technology there now that's getting more and more affordable that can be used. So I think it is exciting to see how, you know, those questions that are still arising can be dealt with by getting some more data and trying to provide predictive analytics to supplement that knowledge and the human aspect of, you know, reviewing the facilities and the capabilities and the culture, as you called it, of the suppliers.
Yeah, and I think if, you know, yes, I think it can help enormously when we're not there, but if you're you know, in a role and you need help, whether it's through the technical aspects of hazard analysis, and you've got tools now, IoT, that can help you gather all the best of the knowledge from around the world in a simpler way, that's got to be a good thing, and that's got to be better than where we are right now, I think.
Yeah, I think so. So hopefully if we revisit the GFSI conference in 10 or more years, they still won't be talking about the recurring incidents of
Let's hope not. I
yeah,
just shudder to think, but
yeah,
let's.
yeah,
Yeah, I think
exactly.
the technology is the difference, actually. I think that's a game changer.
Yeah, exactly. Like the knowledge is there, and needs to be disseminated, but we need more data and more systems that can ensure that those operations are actually operating with the right quality all of the time. And that's, I think, where data and AI has a strength in that it never gets tired of uh, supervising systems. It'll go on and operate at great scale and great speed and scale that knowledge that we need, especially with organizations as large as you've worked in with 10,000 um, plus facilities to keep an eye on, which is incredible, you know. So I think we need to wrap up at that point. So I want to thank you, Sarah, for joining us. It's been very interesting
Thank you.
trying
Great
to find the
discussion.
dots, yeah, between the real underground operational issues and then trying to figure out how we can connect data to help join up the manufacturers and the retailers and even the regulators, so we can all have better transparency and understanding of the science and better quality and safety. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I think we could have gone on for hours. I think it's just such a fascinating subject, but
Yeah,
thank
the
you.
time flew by.
Appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for joining. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.